listeners, welcome to another HRO Today educational podcast. In this series, we aim to provide you the latest workforce management approaches and best practices in HR. I'm Debbie Bolla, Senior Vice President and Editorial Director of HRO Today magazine. In recent years, there's been a surge and now a decline in a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, and this is having a real impact. In fact, research from Kelly reports that 62% of workers said they were planning to leave their job within a year because they report non-inclusive behaviors happening at their organization. So how can HR help reverse this trend? Luckily, I have an expert here today to answer this question and more. Keilon Ratliff is Chief Diversity Officer for Kelly, a staffing and workforce solutions company. In his role as CDO, he leads the development and execution of the company's DEI strategy, including programs and partnerships to attract and retain a diverse and inclusive workforce for Kelly and its clients. Prior to being named CDO, Keilon was a driving force behind the growth of the company's Equity at Work initiative, which makes employment more accessible for job seekers who face discrimination. Thanks, Keilon, for joining me today. Why do you think there's been a recent increase in DEI fatigue?
It's a good question, and I would call it more of a resurgence of fatigue because I do believe that a few years back there was an uptick in people's interest in DEI, and then it hit the fatigue. And then after the George Floyd murder, we've seen a great amount of appreciation and attraction to DEI. Then within the last probably 12 to 18 months or so, we're starting to see more fatigue exist. I believe it exists for a variety of reasons. A few things are, one, uncertainty. So I believe many corporations are somewhat uncertain as to where they should go with DEI. Many companies got into that appreciation or attraction to DEI for sometimes the wrong reasons. Because of that, their strategy wasn't very clear. So their definitions of diversity weren't clear. Their strategy of what to do next wasn't clear. So it became very, very convenient just to push it off or tuck it up underneath other organizations, for example, as opposed to put more of an emphasis and focus on DEI. So also, there's many companies that publicly have deprioritized it because the strategy existed in one part of the organization and maybe didn't exist everywhere or wasn't clearly defined. It's been deprioritized, but if you ask the question, oftentimes they'll answer to say, hey, yes, we're still focused on this, we're still doing A, B, C, but it's really just not a part of maybe their main pillars. So because of that, it's happening. And then you see a lot that's happening politically and in legislation, and some companies are shying away or putting it on pause just because they're not quite sure what direction to go. So you see a bunch of those factors happening. Every corporation has a different strategy around that, but overall, we are definitely experiencing the fatigue of DEI.
And you see so many statistics on how important diversity and inclusion is to attracting talent and retaining talent. So what impact is this decline having on the workforce and HR leaders?
Major impact, just recruiting alone. I mean, now talent is very aware, and, talent is actually demanding a culture of engagement and inclusivity with regards to any company that they want to work for. So the companies that are focused on DEI and create that environment and attraction of inclusivity is landing talent. And so when companies do veer from that strategy, talent understands and they see it, and the market talks. And sometimes corporations don't always have their ear to the market to really understand the impact of that, but it 100% has an impact. There's also a misalignment with internal governing opportunities. So, for example, there may be a talent strategy that exists within an organization that may not tie into the legal side of the organization or the people side of the organization or HR, and there's a missed opportunity there sometimes because those strategies may conflict. And so that has a huge impact. Oftentimes it's not measured. And then even sometimes when it is measured or those strategies conflict, they may create internal mistrust where if operations says, hey, we are really looking at procuring more diverse talent in our workforce and making sure that we continue to emphasis on DEI, but that conflicts, for example, with an internal policy on how to acquire that talent, sometimes it creates that internal mistrust. So, there's a huge impact that it has on an organization if strategies aren't aligned.
So with this in mind, what steps can HR leaders take to reverse the trend?
First and foremost, I think is defining the strategy and understanding how you define diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also, most importantly, belonging. And so working together to understand where do you stand as a corporation as it relates to that. So it's not just an HR function. HR oftentimes is the leading, functional group within an organization that is somewhat communicating that charge, but understanding where everyone stands and gaining that buy-in from the top down is very, very important. So I think how HR's understanding of that and companies' understanding of that and how that aligns is very, very important. And then furthermore, how that is communicated throughout. So it's one thing to define what the goals are related to DEI and where the company wants to go, but how you communicate that throughout the organization and deputize everyone in the company, because DEI and cultural change and inclusion is not just an HR function. That has to be a function of every single member of a corporation. So the communication becomes very, very critical. And then actually assigning governance to it. So making sure that alignment stays aligned, right? So it's not a one-time conversation. It's a conversation that has to be continuous. And so appointing a governing body, right? So a representative from legal, a representative from your, senior leadership team, a representative from operations is very, very important. And then also just really being aligned to policy review and trends. So as the market changes, as things are happening within your company culturally, understanding that governance team needs to be aware, but even with that awareness, being equipped to and be ready and agile for different policy reviews and changes that needs to adapt to the trends is very important.
Right. It sounds like really making it part of your company culture will make a big difference. So what business outcomes will organizations experience if they have a well-thought-out strategy around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
So great question. It's interesting because from a business outcome perspective, oftentimes corporations don't really equate or they don't know how or haven't figured out how to measure DEI and correlate it to actual financial gain. And oftentimes that is why you see corporations veer, because they haven't figured that out. But the corporations that really put forth a sound strategy, the business outcomes will 100% be impacted from a financial perspective. And actually it should become a part of the action items for any leaders in the company, especially any leaders that are measured from a financial perspective. You'll also see a cultural impact from the business outcome perspective around, how you impact your culture as it relates to being agile and instilling that trust in the organization that DEI is important. And then ultimately, you also have a social impact from that as well.
And are there any data or metrics that leaders should keep their eyes on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that from a trending perspective, it starts with setting goals, right? So first you define your DEI and B strategy. And once you define that strategy, how do you measure against that? Measurables, may be, demographic shifts. It may be aligning or creating resource groups within your company. And then based on that, there may be individual goals depending on those resource groups, et cetera, that there should be a focus for. But from a stat perspective, I think there's a variety of things that you can look at and measure. I mean, at Kelly, we look at a host of different things that we actually measure for. So it's demographics, but we also look at that financial impact, and we look at how many people we place on jobs that, we remove barriers for. And those are all things that correlate to our DEI and B strategy. But there's a lot of things that companies can look at. But I think my advice would be to tie it to the business outcomes that you have within your business. So as you're strategizing, setting budget, setting your pillars for the year or strat planning, I think aligning what actions will DEI and B actually impact and correlate to that help us get to these outcomes and actually setting some measurable goals with that.
Being a diversity officer is certainly a challenge right now. What excites you the most about the role, and what do you want to contribute to the future of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
For me, being able to be at the center of being able to actually see direct impact is something I would never give up. And I will tell you at Kelly, from my seat, and I think from most diversity offices, regardless of the company, you do have a great lens into not only your internal enterprise, but also the communities in which you're impacting and the talent that you're helping to procure employment opportunities. And so for me, that is something that drives me. That is something that helps me stay focused on my mission and my vision personally, but also for our corporation. And I know what we stand for and our noble purpose, it really helps push that narrative forward. So great question, and I think that is one that I will continue to see dividends from. So regardless if I'm in this role or not, because of the impact that I see that we make at Kelly, very proud of the role I'm in and the work we get to do.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Keilon, for joining me today. Until next time, listeners, I'm Debbie Bolla.